Welcome to the Soulcery Podcast, your sacred space to delve into spiritual tools, topics, and practices that will illuminate your path of soul remembering and healing. I'm your host, Ligia Costa, a soul guide, alchemist, soul writing coach, and the creator of the T.R.U.S.T Pathway. I'm deeply grateful to have you here with me. Together, we will embark on a profound exploration of self-discovery and healing, unlocking the secrets that lie within. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Soulcery Podcast. And today I would really like to delve into a deeply significant topic that touches my heart, per se, because it basically encompasses my personality trait as a highly sensitive person, as well as trauma. And I would like to dedicate this episode to those of us who experienced life with a more challenging upbringing. And not only that, if you also are one of the 20% of the population who are highly sensitive, my heart goes to you, because experiencing trauma, it's already a very hard thing to go through. But when you are highly sensitive, trauma hits differently. Trauma impacts us so much deeper, and it can be really hard to navigate these challenges with the courage and the grace that it's needed. So my heart goes to you. Before I explain why trauma impacts highly sensitive people differently, I would like first to explain what trauma is, so that you understand what is trauma. Because trauma is a word that carries immense weight and depth, and it encompasses a wide spectrum of experiences. And traditionally, trauma was understood as this life-threatening event that, we go through life. We can look into, for instance, surviving an earthquake, or, childhood abuse, rape, nearly death experience. All of these are valid, and yes, they are life-threatening events that cause immense trauma. But what we now know through a lot of behavioral studies in the areas of science and psychology is that trauma can be anything that disrupts a sense of safety and security. It's any significant instance in our lives that shakes our stability, that forces to reorient and adjust to a new reality that is completely unknown, and it feels really, really unsafe and scary. And again, this can be anything from these major life-threatening events that I mentioned before, but it can also be life transitions. It can also be chronic stress. It can be a significant loss. So all of these things create this disruption in the brain, this disruption in our sense of safety and security. And because we don't have that security, our nervous system goes into flight, fight, or freeze response to help us cope with the threat that we are feeling, right? And so trauma is anything that does that to us, to our nervous system. Because trauma does that to us, it basically reshapes how we see the world, and at times it can completely actually change the course of our lives. For instance, in my case, losing my dad was a major trauma in my life. He lost his life in a very traumatic way. It was very unexpected for me as a daughter as well, the way he passed. And so he basically took me into this dark night of the soul that required a lot of reshaping. a lot of relearning, a lot of recalibrating to a new reality. Now, for highly sensitive people, these moments of disruption that trauma causes can leave a very profound and lasting imprint, mainly because our deep emotional processing means that the impact of trauma is basically magnified. And it can affect us in ways that are both very intense and very challenging to navigate. And then the world around us sometimes, or most times, doesn't understand why certain things impact us so much that we live in this trauma. And I remember, for instance, when I had my daughter and I had to have a C-section. For me, it was a very traumatic event. It was my third pregnancy to term, and I had natural births with both my boys, but with my daughter, because of having a third-degree tear, I had to have a C-section. And the whole experience was very traumatic. I was shaking all the way. I felt myself drift away, as if like I had this out-of-body experience. And it was very traumatic for me. But when I shared this with my family, they kind of minimized what I was feeling. They said, oh, you have to get over it. You know, there was nothing bad that happened. You can't keep thinking about that and not move on. And when we feel things so deeply and you feel trauma so challenging in that way, and then you don't have that support network around you, it makes it even harder to not only navigate but overcome these challenges. So, as I mentioned in previous episodes, and this is a theme that I've been coming over and over again to talk about, highly sensitive people makes out of 20% of the population. And what that means is that we are more sensitive than the average population, right? We are wired to perceive and to process the world with a lot of depth and a lot of sensitivity. We are basically the empaths, the emotional tapestry of the world. And our heightened sensitivity is a survival advantage because as we are so attuned to what's going on around us, we notice things that others miss, and we process information more deeply and faster as well than other people. So when a threat is presenting itself, it's kind of this processing that we have, this cognitive processing, it's so quick and so profound and so automatic even, that it gives us this sense of inner knowing that something is going to happen. So it is a survival advantage, and that's why we are so needed as well for the population, because everyone has a place in the world, and we might not be the warriors, we might not be the ones that go in front of, you know, the cavalry and fight and give ourselves, but we are the advisors, we are the Merlins that basically are just giving advice and processing things from different perspectives. However, this ability to feel more deeply and to have this survival advantage can also mean that we experience trauma in a more intense way. And sometimes it's so overwhelming that we don't see a way out. And that's why we see so many HSPs having bipolar disorders or anxiety or depression, because it gets so overwhelming. We just can't see a way out. We can't move past and know how to cope with trauma because it's so intense. And as a trauma-informed therapist working with highly sensitive people, I've seen firsthand how trauma can impact so deeply, especially when this trauma is experienced in childhood, because it's that time where we are developing, where we need those safe anchors, those safe attachments in a nurturer, a caregiver that can help us regulate our nervous system when we are going through something scary and traumatic. And if we don't have those anchors there, our brains literally, and this is what trauma does to our brains, it changes the neurons in the brain. It affects it so hard that our cognitive development is affected. And so I've seen it and I've experienced it myself as a survivor of childhood abuse. So when trauma strikes, when trauma happens, what happens is highly sensitive people often experience a heightened state of arousal, also called a hyperarousal. And this hyperarousal can manifest in various different ways. For example, increased anxiety, irritability, difficulty sleeping, being heightened startled, right? We startle very, very quickly with the most ridiculous things. And for us, HSPs who normally already are in a state of hyperarousal on a daily basis, trauma will just exacerbate these feelings and will make it even more challenging to navigate daily life, because then we're not only just fighting per se the threat that we are seeing in front of us, that is the trauma, we are also fighting against our own survival mechanism that is taking us into this hyper aroused state to keep us safe, but is not keeping us very safe because we are in this state of overwhelm, magnified like 100 times. It's just like we are electricity. We are always there, bzzz, in the background. I can't even explain how that feels, but we already have that humming all the time with us. But when we go through trauma, it's just an explosion. It's just way too loud, way too overwhelming. And it's really, really hard to just, cope with the daily life as is. But hyperarousal is not the only way that trauma impacts us as highly sensitive. Another thing that we tend to do, because it's so overwhelming to try and navigate and process trauma, what we normally tend to do as a survival mechanism is that we tend to compartmentalize our emotions. So imagine that our brains are a cupboard. Like we have a cupboard inside our brains with different drawers. And we put our emotions in these little drawers, organized by experiences, organized by the people involved. It's just, we organize it so much, but it's just so well compartmentalized, just so that we can actually function on our day-to-day without having that in our heads all the time. But this is just a survival mechanism. It's not a healthy way of coping with the emotions, because we start to shut off certain feelings or certain facets of our personality so that we can function better. And I'm very strong in not repressing, not dismissing or rejecting our emotions. And I'm so strong about it because it's one thing that I have to keep at the forefront of my mind all the time. Because as a highly sensitive person, I tend to do this. And I have to remind myself, no, sit with your emotions and feel your emotions instead of just put them in a drawer. Because in a way, it provides a temporary relief. It gives it that breathing space to actually do something else rather than just worrying and overthinking about the trauma and about what happened to us. But what also happens is that it leads us to ignore our basic needs, both emotional and physical. And that's why, as a result, and I shared this on the podcast before, as a result, I gained weight. When I was going through, and I'm still going through the grief of losing my dad, but the first 2.5 years were really rough. Only just recently, I started to breathe a little bit more and started to pay attention to my physical needs because I ignored it. And because I ignored it, my health just got worse until I kind of woke up and like, okay, before this is getting out of hand and it gets worse, I need to do something about it. Because it's what we do in order to function better. And I needed to function better. I have my children, I have my husband, I have my business. I needed to function. And so I ignored a lot of things, especially my physical health. And other people, for instance, ignore more the emotional health. And that's why it can result in mental health issues or medical problems if it's being overlooked. So it's really, really important that we have this awareness because trauma affects everybody. Trauma is not an easy thing. And I would go to the extent to say that everyone goes through trauma because, as I mentioned before, trauma is not just a life-threatening event. It's anything that disrupts our sense of safety. Trauma can be going through a divorce. Trauma can be moving to another country. Just the shock, just the fact that you don't feel safe or secure and things are unfamiliar, they create this imprint, right? But if you're highly sensitive, you're going to feel this magnified. But one thing that we do have as highly sensitive people is that because we have this deep processing, we are thinkers, we need to understand things on a deeper level. And we spend a lot of time introspecting. It gives us that capacity for resilience and for healing. And we can use this in our advantage when we are trying to navigate the impact of trauma. And I must say, in my case, that was the thing. I believe that the fact that I'm a highly sensitive person and I gave myself the time to grieve, and I went through so many traumatic things in my life, and I'm still here standing. And I believe it's because of this capacity to process and give the space for healing. And so I would like to touch on a few coping strategies that you as a highly sensitive person can use that will help you navigate trauma in a more effective way, and that also uses the strengths of being a highly sensitive person. And the first strategy is really education. To me, education is power. Understanding what we have experienced and why it's so empowering. And we can use this deep thinking that we have, this longing for, finding the meaning in everything, to actually use it in our advantage so that we understand what we went through. And for trauma survivors, having this knowledge is a key part of regaining the power that we lost as a result of trauma. That power of, I wouldn't say being in control, but at least the power of responding rather than reacting, the power of feeling our emotions without losing ourselves in it. We can regain that power because when we know our triggers, when we know our bodies and how our bodies respond to trauma and to stress, we can then help ourselves reduce that stress and anxiety. And that's why psychoeducation is fundamental. It's a fundamental first step in dealing with trauma work. It provides a language to describe our experiences that validates what we are going through, but also not only the psychoeducation, but then moving into working with the soma so that we see how this language is manifesting in our bodies, how these experiences are manifesting in our bodies, and we can work with both the mind and the body to help us go through trauma. Another coping strategy is to limit negative news, because after enduring trauma, it can be really helpful if you limit your exposure to negative news. You're already feeling down. You're already feeling in hyperarousal. You already feel threatened all the time. If you feed your mind and your emotions with negative news that you read on social media, that you watch on TV, you're just going to feel worse. You're going to feel more distressed. And you don't need that. You need really to set boundaries around, for instance, your media consumption, so that you protect your emotional well-being. And be vocal about it. Let your friends and family know that you are avoiding or limiting news that normally feel you very uncomfortable or distressed. For instance, again, another example, when we went through the pandemic, I was not watching the news. I had friends that had the apps on their phones that would tell how many COVID cases were in the area and all of that. I didn't have any of it. I kept away from the news because as a collective, the pandemic was a trauma, right? It created trauma as a collective. The same way World War I and II created a collective trauma that is being passed on to us through the generations that lived through it, right? So the pandemic was another one, another big event that basically took away our safety. It disrupted our life, right? Even though we were not in war and there weren't bombs everywhere, the scaremongering that was on the media, the pressure to take the vaccines, the need to stay inside, not meet our friends, not see our family members, not going out, all of this created a lot of trauma. And on top of that, if we kept watching the news, we will feel more distressed and fearful. And for instance, for me as a highly sensitive person, already in hyperarousal, if I kept consuming the news from the media and the updates of COVID cases and all of that, I know I would just feel worse and my mental health will get worse. So I created those boundaries, and neither of us, my husband didn't watch the news as well. He didn't have the app on, on the phone. If I were in conversations with my friends and they will talk about all of the things like the cases, local cases of COVID and this and that, I would say, well, I don't watch the news. And I would just cut it. I wouldn't go deep into it because I knew it would impact me more. Another coping mechanism is to spend time with others. And I know that as highly sensitive, we have this need to be alone and spend time alone to recharge and to reset and to be with ourselves and not be consumed by other people's emotions and energies. But social connection is such a powerful tool when it comes to the healing process, because trauma can disrupt our sense of safety, as I said, especially around other people. And it makes it so challenging to engage in social activities because we are just so aroused that we are looking around for threats. We read other people's facial expressions. We read their body language. We feel the energy. And sometimes it's too overwhelming. And I know that. So obviously I'm not recommending, go to a rave or go to a nightclub or go to a festival or put yourself in a position where you are gathered with people that don't bring the best in you. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is to keep your social connection going. And you can do that by finding supportive groups or communities that can make a difference in how you feel. And there are support groups for trauma survivors, are support groups for grief, for people that are going through grief. There are group activities that focus on regulating the vagus nerve, for example, so that it helps with nervous system regulation, like singing in a chorus. And we had an amazing guest not long ago that she has these singing groups where she actually helps people with singing, not to teach them how to sing and have a career of it, but really just so they can regulate the nervous system, and it's quite impressive. Or you can take a self-defense class, as that will help to rebuild trust and safety. What is important is really to engage with other people and to practice mindfulness and acceptance of where you are in your healing journey. Don't judge where you are in your healing journey, because everyone is different. And as highly sensitive, we are already a part of a group that will feel trauma more intensely than others. And we already feel so inadequate in so many areas of our lives. So when we go through trauma, we have to be very mindful to find a supportive group that will not judge how sensitive we are, how emotional we can get, how overwhelmed we can get. Because sometimes other people might think we are overreacting to something when in fact we are actually reacting to trauma in such a magnified way that it's really overwhelming. And for that reason, it's really important that you're very authentic about the way you feel, the way you struggle, and share it. Share it with someone that you trust, your partner, a parent, a sibling, a best friend, someone that you really, really trust and that you know that is not going to judge you or make you feel worse about, your emotional response. And if you don't have anyone in your close proximity, try and find an online support group or a podcast you can listen to or a self-help book that you can read. Okay? Just try and not isolate yourself in moments like this. And it's so easy, especially for us HSPs, it's so easy to isolate ourselves because the processing takes so much of our energy, and then trying to explain it to other people, it just drains us so much. But you don't have to talk about it. It's just important that you don't isolate yourself, because it can be so easy to, I'm going to spend time with myself, I'm going to be alone, I need alone time, which we do so badly. But then there is a very fine line between choosing to be alone to recharge and to make sense of things and isolating ourselves to the point that then we can't really have connections with anyone else. So be very mindful of that. I really hope this episode was helpful and that explained a little bit why trauma hits differently if you are a highly sensitive person. If you have any questions, please reach out. You can reach out to me on social media or by email. If you have anything to share, anything that I can help with, please reach out. Before I love you and leave you, I'll pull a card from the T.R.U.S.T Journaling Deck. And the card that I pulled is from the Truth Suite, and the soul inquiry is, where do I feel stuck? How is it affecting me? Where do I feel stuck? How is it affecting me? And the affirmation is, I'm ready to change my life. Again, thank you so much for listening to this conversation, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you for listening to the Soulcery Podcast and for holding space for this conversation. It is truly magical to be able to walk with you on this journey of soul healing and inner transformation. If you resonated with this episode and found it valuable, I would be grateful if you could leave a review on iTunes. Your feedback helps me reach more souls searching for guidance and healing. For more guidance and soul wisdom to support soul awakening women through the journey of alchemy, please visit my website www.ligiacosta.co.uk. Love and healing to all. See you on the next one.